The woman walked in like she owned the place, and for one terrible moment, Rosalind Archer thought she might be right. The pharmacy department meeting had been running for 40 minutes. Dr. Khaled had just begun reading Rosalind's nomination for the Ontario Pharmacy Excellence Award. 12 years of service, a record with no disciplinary marks, a commitment to accuracy that had made her one of Toronto General's most trusted clinical pharmacists. When the conference room door opened and Tasha Bellamy stepped inside, Rosalind recognized her immediately. She'd met her twice at Medbridge Functions, the pharmaceutical company where Joel worked. A sharp-faced young woman who wore blazers a size too small and had the specific energy of someone who'd decided, early in life, that she didn't owe anyone patience. Tasha was Medbridge's head of marketing. She had no reason to be in this room, in this hospital, at this time, on a Wednesday morning in March. And yet here she was, holding a manila envelope in both hands the way a person carries something they want everyone to notice. "I'm sorry to interrupt." She didn't look sorry. "I need to bring something to administration's attention. It concerns patient safety." The silence that fell was total. Dr. Khaled set down the nomination letter. Tasha placed the envelope on the conference table. Inside were printouts, dispensing logs carrying Rosalind's staff credentials, showing altered quantities across 6 months, opioid orders that didn't match patient charts, discrepancies in quantities that, if real, would suggest systematic, deliberate manipulation of controlled substances. Rosalind looked at the documents. She knew those records. She knew what they were actually supposed to say. She knew what these said instead. The gap between the two was something she couldn't bridge quickly enough. Not in that room, not in front of 13 colleagues, whose faces had all shifted at the same moment. That particular shift, when a person becomes uncertain about someone they thought they knew. "I received these anonymously," Tasha said. Her voice was calibrated to sound reluctant. "I felt I had a legal obligation." "Rosalind." Dr. Khaled's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "We'll need you to step out while we contact compliance." She stepped out. She stood in the hallway under the fluorescent hum and the particular antiseptic smell of the hospital she had worked in for 12 years, and she listened to the sounds that hadn't changed. Monitors, footsteps, a child, crying somewhere on the 3rd floor, the intercom calling a name she didn't recognize. Everything was exactly the same, and none of it had anything to do with her anymore. She called Joel. Voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She sent a text. "Something's happened. Call me now," and waited. Her phone stayed quiet. 40 minutes later, her director asked her to surrender her access card. She handed it over without a word. She walked out through the sliding glass doors of Toronto General and stood on University Avenue in the March cold, the wind off the lake cutting through her coat, and she called her father. Gerald Archer picked up on the second ring. They had always been close in the way that people who've survived the same loss are close. Rosalind's mother had left when she was 11, and it had been Gerald who made sure she had clean uniforms, someone at her school performances, someone who checked her homework, and never missed a parent interview. He'd been a Crown attorney with the Ontario Ministry of Justice for 28 years. He understood evidence. He understood the particular damage that lies, carefully arranged, could do to a person's life. When Rosalind told him what had happened, standing on the sidewalk with traffic moving past her on University, he was quiet for a moment. She heard him set something down. "Where are you?" he asked. "Outside the hospital." "Go home. Don't speak to anyone from Medbridge. Don't post anything. Don't respond to anything online." A pause. "I'm going to make some calls." "Dad, I didn't alter anything. Those records aren't." "I know," he said. There was something in the steadiness of those 2 words that she held on to for the rest of the day. She'd met Joel Ferris at a fundraiser for sick kids 8 years ago. He'd been charming in the particular way of people who've been praised for their charm since childhood. Fluid in conversation, quick with names, the kind of person who made everyone in a room feel temporarily chosen. She'd found it appealing. Later, she would understand it as a professional skill he happened to use in all settings. They'd married 2 years later. Their son, Marcus, 7 now, and obsessed with earthworms, hockey statistics, and the structural integrity of cardboard, had arrived the year after that. For a while the arrangement worked the way busy lives work. Efficient, parallel, not particularly warm. The crack started 3 years ago. Joel's travel schedule expanded. Conferences in Calgary, client dinners in Montreal, a string of Vancouver trips that never quite lined up with what she could verify on the MedBridge website. She stopped asking. She put the energy somewhere it would do good, into Mark, into her patients, into the compliance systems she'd spent years helping to refine. 8 months ago, reviewing a routine MedBridge invoice that had come through the pharmacy contracts desk, she'd noticed a discrepancy. Drug quantities listed on the invoice didn't match the dispensing records. A small difference. The kind of thing that might be administrative error, might be nothing. She flagged it to the hospital's compliance office. Standard procedure. She forgot about it within the week. She didn't know that Tasha Bellamy had intercepted that memo before it reached the right desk. She didn't know what that interception had started. By the following morning, someone was rearranging the internet. Anonymous accounts had appeared across healthcare forums, local Facebook groups, and 2 Reddit threads. They carried what were described as patient testimonials, vague, horrified accounts of medication errors, of a pharmacist who'd been unreachable and careless, of complaints that had supposedly gone nowhere. One account had a profile picture of a generic stock avatar and had been created 43 hours earlier. Another was later traced to an IP address registered to a server farm in Mississauga. Nina Sorrell called at 8 in the morning, her voice tight. Someone's running a campaign. These accounts are all new. They post, they get engagement, and then they delete before anyone can report them. This is organized. Rosalind sat at her kitchen table with her tea going cold and scrolled through what Nina had sent. One comment read, "This pharmacist almost killed my grandfather and the hospital covered it up for years." It had 62 likes. Rosalind had never met the commenter's grandfather. She was reasonably certain the commenter's grandfather did not exist. She put her phone face down on the table. From Mark's room, she could hear the sounds of getting ready. Drawers, the particular thump of a child putting on a shoe, and she focused on those sounds until the noise in her chest quieted enough to function. Gerald arrived at 11 with 2 coffees from Tim Hortons and a printed folder he'd been building since 6 that morning. He spread the pages across the kitchen table beside the science project Mark had left behind. "The posts went up within 5 hours of the hospital meeting," he said. "Someone had this content ready before the meeting took place. That's not a reaction. That's a rollout." He turned a page. "Tasha Bellamy registered a marketing firm in her name 4 months ago. It has 1 client of record and no public portfolio." "1 client," Rosalind said. "That's what I intend to establish." He looked at her over his coffee. "Give me time." Joel came home that evening. He let himself in with his key. She hadn't changed the locks yet, which she recognized, even then, as a kind of hope she hadn't fully let go of, and stood in the front hallway looking at her with the expression of a person who hasn't yet settled on a story. "I heard about the leave," he said. "Are you all right?" "Was it Tasha?" she asked. The half-second delay, before he answered, was the most honest thing he'd said to her in months. "Tasha works in marketing. She wouldn't have access to your records." "I didn't ask what she had access to." He set his jacket on the hook. "You're under an enormous amount of stress. It's natural too." "I need you to leave," she said. Her voice was quiet and she meant every word of it. "Please take what you need for a few days and go." He started to say her name. She went to Mark's room and closed the door softly behind her. And she sat on the edge of her son's bed in the dark until she heard the front door close and the particular silence that follows someone leaving. Gerald's first breakthrough came 10 days later. The dispensing logs Tasha had presented listed specific timestamps for when the alterations had supposedly been made. Gerald's contact, a cybersecurity specialist who'd done forensic work for the ministry for 15 years, compared those timestamps against Toronto General's server authentication logs. The modifications had been made using a contractor login that had been decommissioned 18 months prior. The contractor's firm had done IT work for MedBridge. She didn't do this alone, Gerald told Rosalind and Nina, spreading the printed documentation across the kitchen table. She used someone with knowledge of old access credentials. This was planned months in advance. Before I even filed the compliance flag, Rosalind said. She was watching you from the moment you joined that contract review committee, Gerald said. When the flag appeared, she moved. He lined up the pages. But the metadata doesn't lie. The modifications don't match the system architecture that was in place at those timestamps. There was a software update in November that changed the log format. The fabricated records use the old format, but they're timestamped after the update. Whoever made them didn't know about the change. Nina exhaled slowly, so we can prove they're fabricated. We already have, Gerald said. He turned another page. The financial records for Tasha's marketing firm show wire transfers from an account associated with Medbridge's discretionary budget. The account's authorized signatory is Joel. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. He funded it. There'll be room for him to argue he didn't know its purpose, Gerald said carefully, but he funded it. She looked at the papers in front of her. Outside, Mark was at school. The apartment was very still. What do we do with all of this? She asked. Gerald straightened the stack. We bring it to the right people before Tasha can get ahead of it. 3 weeks later, the Ontario Pharmacy Association held its annual recognition dinner at the Fairmont Royal York on Front Street. 400 people in a high-ceilinged ballroom. Clinical pharmacists, hospital administrators, pharmaceutical executives, 2 city councilors, and the kind of healthcare journalists who write carefully and carry recording devices in their breast pockets. Gerald had been invited through a former colleague on the association's board, a woman named Cora Nail, who'd spent 15 years in healthcare law before taking the executive director position. He'd called her 4 days earlier and spoken for 40 minutes. She'd asked 5 precise questions, and then said quietly, "I think this needs to be in the room." Rosalind hadn't wanted to go. She sat at the kitchen table the afternoon before, nursing her second coffee, and told her father she couldn't walk into that room and be looked at the way the internet had been looking at her for 3 weeks. Gerald sat across from her. He wasn't a demonstrative man. That wasn't how he'd been raised, and the ministry hadn't softened it. But he put his hand over hers on the table, briefly, and she went quiet. "Your mother left," he said, "and I didn't fight the way I should have for what came after. I told myself it wasn't my place. I've thought about that for a long time." He met her eyes. "This is my place. Let me do it right." She went. The Fairmont's ballroom was warm light and white linen, and the particular low murmur of a profession that takes itself seriously. Rosalind arrived with Gerald on her left and Nina on her right. She wore a deep green dress that had been in her wardrobe for 2 years, still with the tags, waiting for something worth wearing it to. Tasha Bellamy arrived 40 minutes later. She came with a publicist and a photographer. She wore ivory, a deliberate choice, the color of someone who wants to project an absence of guilt. She worked the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed this entrance, accepting introductions, positioning herself near the award display, tilting her chin at precisely the right angle for the camera. From across the room, she was polished and unassailable. Gerald watched her from beside the bar without saying anything. He had already spoken to Cora Neal that afternoon. The presentation was ready. When the evening moved to announcements, Cora Neal stepped to the microphone. The room settled. "Before we reach our award presentations," she said, "I need to address something directly, because I believe this community deserves to hear it from this organization and not from a news cycle." She presented the findings without drama: server authentication records, metadata inconsistencies, the decommissioned contractor credentials, the incorporation date of Tasha's marketing firm, 4 months before any of this had begun, the wire transfers from Medbridge's discretionary account. Behind her, on the projection screen, each piece of evidence appeared in sequence. Clean, documented, time-stamped, the kind of evidence that requires no interpretation. The room was absolutely still. Then someone near the center said, clearly enough to carry, "My God." Tasha's voice cut across the ballroom, sharp and rising. "That's fabricated. You can't present fabricated." She was on her feet. Her publicist was at her elbow, saying something urgent and low. The photographer had stopped pointing his camera at Tasha and was pointing it at the screen instead. "The Ontario College of Pharmacists has been provided with this evidence." Cora Neal continued from the podium, steady as anything. A complaint has been filed with Toronto Police Service. Rosalind Archer's hospital credentials have been reinstated, effective immediately. Tasha took 3 steps toward the podium. Security staff materialized, unhurried but present, and she stopped. Rosalind sat at her table and did not look at Tasha. She looked at the centerpiece, at her own hands folded in front of her. She was aware of Gerald beside her, not touching her, just solidly there, the way he had been solidly there, her whole life in the ways that counted. The publicist guided Tasha toward the exit. The ivory dress caught the light as she went. The room began to breathe again. By the following morning, the story had moved beyond the healthcare press. 2 national outlets had picked it up. Social media was a different kind of noise now. Not anonymous accounts and false testimonials, but named people sharing Cora Neal's official statement, sharing the association's communication, putting Rosalind's name in contexts that didn't include the word accused. Tasha, from wherever she'd gone after the Fairmont, issued a statement through her publicist. The evidence had been manipulated. She was the real victim of a campaign by a family with legal connections and an agenda. The statement had 53 words. Gerald's team screenshot it and added it to the file. Every claim she makes now becomes testable, Gerald told Rosalind the next morning. Let her keep talking. Joel called at 9. She answered because she was tired of not answering. I didn't know what she was going to do with any of it, he said. He sounded hollowed out in a way she'd never heard from him. Joel, who always had a register for every room. I swear to you, I thought she was handling PR. I didn't know she was going to. You signed the transfers, she said. A long pause. The specific silence of a person who doesn't have a reframe ready. I was protecting the company. You were protecting yourself. She said it without anger, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel angry. Instead, she felt something cleaner. You've been doing that since the beginning. That's not something I can fix from the outside. Rosalind, please. Call my lawyer, she said. Everything else goes through her. She hung up. She made Mark's breakfast. She helped him find his left shoe, which had ended up under the couch, which was where it always ended up. She walked him to the school 2 blocks over and stood at the gate until he disappeared inside. Then she went home and sat at the kitchen table and let herself be quiet for a few minutes, which she hadn't done in a long time. Tasha Bellamy was charged 6 weeks later, fraud and unauthorized computer access under the criminal code. Her marketing firm was dissolved the same week. Medbridge terminated Joel's employment after the internal audit flagged the wire transfers, and the compliance report Rosalind had filed 8 months earlier was finally reviewed in full by the Ministry of Health. What they found wasn't what Rosalind had expected. The invoice discrepancy she'd flagged had been the visible edge of a billing arrangement running for 2 years. Inflated quantities, contracts renewed without proper tender process, money moving in directions it had no business going. Tasha hadn't only been protecting Joel. She'd been protecting a system they'd both been profiting from, and Rosalind's routine compliance flag, filed without ceremony, forgotten within the week, had been, without her knowing it, the thing that could have unraveled all of it. She thought about that sometimes. How you can stumble onto something much larger than you understood, just by doing your job the way you were supposed to. On a Thursday evening in June, Gerald came for dinner. Mark made the salad, mostly croutons and exactly 2 cherry tomatoes, and they ate on the back porch in the kind of early summer warmth that Toronto holds for a few weeks before the humidity arrives and reminds everyone where they actually live. After Mark had gone inside to conduct further earthworm research, Rosalind turned to her father. Nina told me something last week, she said. Apparently Cora Neal received an anonymous tip 3 days before the gala. Someone sent her a portion of the evidence, just enough to make sure she'd take the meeting with you seriously. Gerald picked up his coffee. Do you know who sent it? Rosalind asked. He was quiet for a moment. I might have some sense of who a concerned party could have been. She looked at him. You prepositioned it. A person with my background knows that evidence, however solid, only moves if it reaches someone willing to act on it, he said. I wasn't going to let you walk into that room on a hope. Rosalind was quiet. She thought about being 11 years old and Gerald at the kitchen table with her multiplication tables, making sure she had it right before the test. She thought about him at her pharmacy school graduation, in the second row, in his good suit, looking like someone who'd held his breath for 4 years and was only now letting it go. "You should have told me," she said. "You would have told me not to." She considered that. "Yeah," she said, "I would have." He nodded. They sat with the evening settling around them, the city's low hum coming over the fence, the light going gold in the leaves of the neighbor's maple, a streetcar somewhere distant moving through its tracks. "You did well," he said. It was a small sentence, but Gerald had always been economical with the ones that mattered most. "We did," she said. The Ontario Pharmacy Excellence Award was represented to Rosalind Archer at the association's June meeting. A smaller room, no spotlight, no ivory dresses, no photographer in the corner waiting to make someone look important. The certificate said the same things the original had said. She thanked Cora Neal, shook hands with Dr. Khalid, and carried the award home in her bag on the subway, reading the evening commuter news on her phone like everyone else on the train. She hung it in Mark's room. When he asked why it wasn't in her office, she told him she wanted him to see it every morning when he woke up. "What did you do to get it?" he asked. She thought about that for a moment. About 12 years of careful work, about an invoice no one else would have noticed, about standing in a hospital hallway, handing over her access card, about a ballroom on Front Street, where the truth had arrived on a projection screen, in front of 400 people, and refused to be argued with. "I showed up," she said, "even when it was very hard, especially then." Mark considered this with the gravity of a child processing, something that doesn't have an easy place to go. Then he nodded, satisfied, and went back to his book. Rosalind turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway for a moment. The city was doing what it always did. Carrying on, indifferent and alive, full of people moving through things no one else could see. She could hear a streetcar somewhere. She could hear Mark turning a page. She went to make dinner, and the evening settled around her like something that had been waiting, patiently, for her to let it in.